Good morning, everyone. I'm Catherine Scallen. So, talking about belonging, inclusion, exclusion, and I'm going to look at two different moments in the past, both in the Netherlands, and this way talk about Low Countries, both what is now Belgium and what is now the Netherlands proper, north. In the 16th century is one moment I'll look at, and the 17th century is another moment, and show where, in this case, issues of immigration, of refugees, of divisions in societies were particularly acute. So the first moment that we'll look at is Antwerp. Antwerp in the 16th century. Antwerp today looks like a charming, cute little town. It was an economic powerhouse in the 16th century. It was the most important mercantile and financial center of Europe. The harbor there was where most ships would come in and out for the New World at that point, so incredibly rich, and as I said, very powerful as part of this larger Holy Roman Empire. That will be a problem politically in a little bit. It is also a very important center for Protestantism, really almost from the get-go, from around 1520s. More typically Calvinism than Lutheranism, okay, but very much Protestant. A lot of artisans, a lot of merchants go in that direction. That will become a problem by about the 1540s, because Spain, which is ruling that area of the world, is becoming increasingly kind of rigid and orthodox in its Catholicism. And by the 1550s, they're bringing in the Inquisition. And this is, not just terribly disruptive of everything, but, it's tearing families apart with divisions. People are leaving. There's a lot of migration out of Antwerp and other cities in what is now Belgium, going towards England and going to Germany, to centers where it'll be safer to be a Protestant. And so we have two things going on kind of simultaneously, still very wealthy, dominant, and yet a great deal of social tension there. One subject that we may see or we may not, the adoration of the Magi, which was one that goes pretty far back in Christian art, very popular one, partly because it's colorful and it's beautiful and it's about bringing people together. This becomes one of the most popular subjects made in Antwerp. Antwerp had not been a big artistic center before about 1520. And again, with everything else booming, it booms. And a lot of merchants will come there from foreign countries and feel, maybe we could say a little sad. They're away from their families, away from their homes. And one of the main paintings they like to buy, either for a church or for a private home, is a study of the adoration of the Magi. And one of the images that will eventually be in the PowerPoint is by an artist named Jos van Cleve, who was himself an immigrant, came from Germany to work in Antwerp. And it was commissioned by a man from Genoa, a merchant from Genoa, who would become the Doge, or the Duke of Genoa, in 1528. And this man commissioned, we believe specifically, this very large altarpiece from Jos van Cleve right around that time, 1526-28. And there's a portrait of this man in there with the Magi. All right, so he's kind of putting in his claim, and this is why people like the Medici down in Florence love the subject. They like to associate as well. But it's interesting, he does this when he's in this foreign city, commissions it. Unfortunately, we don't know where it went after that. We'd love to know, did he bring it down to Italy with him, which a lot of Italians did with Netherlandish paintings, or was it left up in the north? What's also interesting in that painting is among the Magi, there is a black African. starting in the late 15th century, it became customary to show one of the Magi as an African, to show not just that these people came from the East, the Magi, but in fact they're coming from all over the world. So there's this guy wearing this outlandish hat that's meant to represent China, and you have this African. He can either be Caspar or Balthazar, depending on this. But it also tells us about the changing world for Europe, how much more global it's becoming in its outlook in the 16th century. And we'll return to the subject of blacks in Netherlandish art near the end of this talk. So we have Jos van Cleve doing this adoration of the Magi, and as I said, other lots and lots being produced. Jump up about a generation to 1564 or so, and Peter Bruegel, otherwise known in America as Peter Bruegel, there is no sound like oi in Dutch, okay? Peter Bruegel, the elder, the most famous of them, does an adoration of the Magi that looks very different. It doesn't look celebratory, it looks tense. Everyone looks anxious. The Holy Family aren't these gorgeous ideal figures, but are kind of lumpy, bumpy people, real people. And in the back of the painting, there is an image of a row of soldiers. And it's really hard to know, why are they there? They don't look like they're part of the retinue of the Magi. They're not really associated with them, but it's kind of this bristling road. So it's this claustrophobic, frankly unattractive painting, totally different from adorations before. And so the question is, why? Why are we getting such a difference between, say, 1526 and 1564? It is about those religious divides. See how different it feels? We're kind of trapped in space there. The soldiers there in the back with armor that's very 16th century looking. And the three kings, of course, but who's the person whispering to Joseph? Everything here is a little bit mysterious. In the 1560s, we've now gone through a generation of this repression of Protestantism. And the 1560s in particular is an extremely tense time. Things are almost ready to explode. And they will in a few years, first with an iconoclasm in 1566, not just in Antwerp, but in other cities. And that the Spanish monarchy really slams down, brings in troops everywhere. There were some before, but overdoes it at that point in the Netherlands. And by 1568, open warfare between Spain and the Low Countries. The 80 years war, it will not be settled till 1648. The rest on the flight into Egypt. This was one of the first topics when I was talking to Patricia and others about this that came up. And, again, around 1510, this may be as late as 1515 or so, Gerard David, these wonderful and very approachable images of the Holy Family. So here it's not about the tension of the fact they're fleeing from Herod's decree to kill all these male infants 2 years and under, but it's about that taking time, Joseph getting fruit there in the background in the tree, the Christ child playing with grapes, Eucharist, a symbol prefiguring his future, but still a very pleasant and beautiful image. Again, Peter Bruegel, when we get to 1563, here we see the Holy Family in the foreground, going through this countryside, but it's much more threatening now, the countryside, much more difficult, I should say. This is a kind of challenge for them now. And it's also hard to see here, but there are actually other figures right over here. Going into this cave. And it's meant to be considered perhaps about how do we relate to the Holy Family, in this case as the dangers of the journey through life. So we are all pilgrims and we are all refugees in life, and going through that is an enormous challenge. And this was a very popular type of composition at the time. It's called a world landscape, where we can see almost to the curvature of the earth. But to put the Holy Family in there makes them more humble, more human, and more threatened in that way. Why were they fleeing? All right, as I said, Herod's decree. And so Peter Bruegel, again, right in the same time, these mid-1560s, a very tense time, does this painting. Now, Bruegel's in an interesting position. We've never figured out where he stands on religion. Did he remain Catholic? Did he become a Protestant? A lot of his friends were from Antwerp were in the Protestant group, the kind of intelligentsia, but then he moved to Brussels and worked at the court, which was Catholic, and he's very good at covering his tracks. And that was important if he wanted to maintain a career, and it was also a very, as I said, dangerous time. So here we see The Massacre of the Innocents by Bruegel, and it's set in a winter scene in a Flemish village, all right? So it's brought right to contemporary time. Not only that, the soldiers here are imperial soldiers and German mercenaries. We know from their costumes. So he is making this a contemporary scene, very much. Everyone would pick up on that at the time. So here's the image of iconoclasm when works were taken down, destroyed. In some cases, people did save them and hide them. But going from church to church, town to town, through the Netherlands, from the south up into the northern part of the Low Countries at that time. I'm showing this again because something interesting happened to this painting about a generation after it was done. It was owned by Rudolf II in Prague, the Holy Roman Emperor. He's related to the Spanish Habsburgs who are ruling this part of the world. And he was very disturbed by some things in the original appearance of the painting, so he had them painted over. And the way it is in the Royal Collection in England now is still that over-painted condition. However, we have a copy, a very good copy, of the painting by Peter Bruegel's son. And here we can see that there are actually dead children in this massacre. And it maybe felt a little too pointed for the Holy Roman Emperor of what his relatives had been doing in the Netherlands. A little too painful to see that kind of imagery at the time. So this is the cause of migrants, immigrants, people fleeing from persecution. Antwerp has it bad in this time. In 1576, there's a siege of the city by the Spanish troops. It's retaken for Spain. Many people are killed, and throughout, all these people are fleeing. And so we have, late in the 16th century, this Mostart painting of the flight into Egypt. And you can see the Holy Family there, kind of on the left foreground. They're dressed in sort of timeless attire, but we have other people fleeing as well in front of them. Once more, this winter landscape with a kind of Flemish village in it. People falling on the ice, they're out there playing, but this was considered a kind of a symbol of fortune, to fall on the ice. That's what life does to you, right? And so a full generation after Peter Bruegel, the impact of the story is still very clear, that this is about the threat that they felt. Many, many, many people left the southern Netherlands at this time, fleeing from the Spanish. And that had started, as I said, 1540s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 1580s. It's all going on at that. And so this flight into Egypt would have really resonated as a subject in the contemporary world for these people. So we get this division around this time, late 16th century, formalized in 1648, between those green areas in the south, which are retaken for Spain in this war, and then the kind of orange and pink and green and up in the north that will break off and become the United Provinces. It becomes an early republic. And so we have, again, the wheel of fortune turning, and now Antwerp literally kind of falls in importance for a while because the rebels, as they were viewed by Spain, blockade the harbor of Antwerp. And so it can't be this important port during that time. Antwerp falls, Amsterdam rises in importance. Trade goes there. And especially when it becomes clear that they're trying out this new form of government, this republic, there will be, for the time, an unusual degree of religious toleration here. Again, same thing had happened in the North, that there were families that were split, some remaining Catholic, some going over to Calvinism or Lutheranism, and they don't want that anymore. They really want things to be about tolerance. This is both a spiritual and a financial decision, to be honest, because Amsterdam will rise, now become the leading mercantile and financial center for its policies in that way. And right around the same time that's happening, well, we get now the 30 Years' War. It's overlapping with the 80 Years' War. Europe is a mess. 30 Years' War has the distinction of being the most demographically disastrous event in Europe between the Black Death and the World Wars. In Germany, 15 to 20% of the population is killed. It includes what is now Germany, separate groups at that point, but Germany, Austria, Sweden, France, England, everybody gets involved virtually in this war. The Dutch say, we're fighting our own war, we'll stay out of it, but the Spanish are involved in it too, and it's a horrific thing. So what happens? Well, all sorts of migration coming to Amsterdam. We have migration coming from Germany, from Sweden. These are poor people. Often they had been rural poor. They're coming in and being urban poor now, and there's tension between the kinds of poor. The urban poor feel like they're being overwhelmed by the rural poor, all right? And it's problematic those ways. We have people coming in from Portugal, Jews in particular. Often they had been what are called crypto-Jews. They had they publicly converted to Catholicism, their families, the end of the 15th century when the Spanish and Portuguese monarchs said convert or leave, okay? But in the 16th century, the Inquisition goes after those families too, saying, we're not sure that was a real conversion. Maybe you're really still Jews and doing things in private. It was true for a lot of people, a lot of families. So they come to Amsterdam as well. So it becomes this kind of interesting new melting pot. By the way, there's one irony. A lot of the immigrants that came from the southern Netherlands up to the north were wealthy or very good artisans, and so a lot of people in the north actually resented them, saying, you're going to take over our economy, you're going to take over all our jobs. Sound familiar? Rembrandt, all right, he will be our second guy. He's a very young artist when he starts doing images of beggars in the late 1620s, early 1630s. And in fact, that's the subject he does more often than any other in his first years as an artist, say 1627 to 1631. And you can imagine he actually is growing up in the university town of Leiden, and these begging poor are coming from all over Europe, but especially fleeing from the 30 Years' War. And so he's seeing figures here, cripples, old people in all sorts of garb. Now, I showed these are prints, which are done in multiples, but they're almost all very tiny. And he may have actually brought prepared little copper plates with him out into the streets and actually looked at some of these people coming in. And that is a very interesting thought as well. And so we have here a hurdy-gurdy player, a violin player. These guys have all sorts of instruments, go around begging. Beggar with a wooden leg. And they are, how do I phrase it? They're picturesque in a way because they're exotic, they're the other, but you don't feel Rembrandt is condemning them or judging them. There were other people who had rather vicious images of beggars, we'll see in just a moment. He's not the only one doing it. Even a few years earlier, the French artist Jacques Callot is doing a whole series of beggars, and France is hit hard by the 30 Years' War, and so people like this were seen all over. This is sort of contemporary reportage in a sense. But as I said, beggars, they were a problem in Europe. Now, According to Catholic theology, giving alms directly to those who are poor is a good gift and is part of the sign that, you are a good person and will earn your spot in heaven. Of course, we know that that's a disagreement with most Protestants, justification by faith alone and saved by grace alone. Good deeds, they're great to do, but they're not going to win you a place in heaven. And then there are all sorts of arguments about the poor, the deserving poor, and the undeserving poor at this time. Once again, Martin Luther's a great example of that because he had in his pocket when he died a piece of paper that says, "We are all beggars, it is true," meaning all human beings are beggars. And yet he worried that Germany was being overrun by beggars from other countries. And were they all honest or beggars or not? Or were some of them fakes? So we get these kinds of images that are meant to be mocking, such as the previous one, and people looking at them both satirically but with great suspicion. Are these genuine people in need or not? They are outsiders. They're often shown outside the city gates, such as that Peter Bruegel painting. Or they show up in connection, with carnival here, as if they are actors in this larger kind of pageant of life. So there's a lot of suspicion to this kind of, I guess you could call them refugee. Again, often people from the countryside who get displaced and come to urban centers. Peter Bruegel prints himself in the guise of a beggar. Is this a theological statement? Is he, like Martin Luther, saying, on earth we are all beggars as Christ himself was? Another one of Martin Luther's comments of the time. I'm not going to go and try to attribute too far beliefs of Rembrandt, but throughout his career, I will say this: he seems to have unusual sympathy for people who are sometimes a little bit on the outside of the mainstream. Even as a young artist, he's interested in old people, and what young person is ever interested in old people? And shows wonderfully sympathetic depictions of them. And so that is, I think, a very interesting etching indeed. A much later one is also interesting, this family receiving alms from 1648. This is well into Rembrandt's maturity as an artist. And this is produced in great numbers. Now, what this seems to show is more along the lines of Catholic charity, direct giving. In Amsterdam at this time, they had a system set up where there was a box outside of each house where people could put in alms that are collected periodically by the city and by the officers of a certain kind of company, I should say more like a board of trustees, and then distributes it through institutions. That's what they want to do in the northern Low Countries, have it be a kind of institutional alms giving. So this seems to be more the old-fashioned mode of it. But it is at the same time, as I said, a kind of really, this is a really sympathetic, compared to almost all the images I've seen before of people begging, of the idea of all these people who are displaced. This is being done right at the end of the 30 Years' War, of the 80 Years' War. And Rembrandt, through his whole career, has seen these kinds of poor people. And whether he identifies with them directly or not, he seems to be able to show them in a far more sympathetic way than most people would have at the time. Where Rembrandt lives in Amsterdam from the late 1630s to the mid-1650s is a street called the Breestraat, the Broad Street. Later, it will become known as the Jodenbreestraat, the Jewish Broad Street, because it's part of Amsterdam where an awful lot of the Sephardic Jews coming from Portugal settled. The Jewish synagogue is right there, and they are the Portuguese synagogue, and they are able to worship there openly. Again, there are some restrictions. Jews cannot hold public office, but neither could Roman Catholics in the northern Low Countries at this time. Rembrandt seems to know personally quite a few of the, again, intelligentsia, kind of like Bruegel. And so here we have the Dr. Ephraim Bueno, whose family come from Portugal. He studied medicine in Bordeaux, and he was also a poet. And this is the kind of person Rembrandt did portraits of. They seem to have been done through friendship in part. So this whole Sephardic Jewish community here is one that Rembrandt is, in a sense, participating in through friendships. But it's interesting, when he goes out to pick subjects that are anything like that, he goes out and sees people more from the Ashkenazi, the poorer Jews that have come from Eastern Europe, and their kind of colorful clothing for Rembrandt, kind of the exotic. But I mean, he is really associating that with biblical times. And that's why an etching like this done in 1648 shows these kinds of figures here, potentially at an Ashkenazi synagogue.
Why the question mark in the title?
Because people aren't sure if it is really just Jews in the synagogue or if it's the specific story of the Pharisee who kind of brags about how great he is in the public and says, I'm just a sinner, and guess which one you're supposed to be. In that same area of town, there is a community of Black Africans. And this research, by the way, is very recent. People knew about it, but did not do research until really this decade in any great extent. Now, this image would suggest an enslaved person because he's wearing a slave collar. They weren't that common, actually, in the Netherlands, but it was a symbol very quickly to show these distinctions. Where are these people coming from? I can't, boy, I'd be careful. I could get into way too much detail, but it's a complicated thing that a lot of the Sephardic Jews from Portugal had been involved in Portugal's enterprises in Brazil. And Portugal was importing a lot of African enslaved people to Brazil. There were indigenous peoples. There's a lot of mixing of races there among the people who are working for the Portuguese. Then in the mid-1630s, both some of the ports in Africa that Portugal had maintained control over are conquered by the Dutch. And so is Portuguese Brazil. The Portuguese get it back later in the century, but there's about a 25-year period when the Dutch are doing that. So there had been Africans coming in from the late 16th century to Amsterdam, but not in the numbers that we will see in the 17th century. Some of them are enslaved, some of them are free. There is a small free community of Africans, and it's right near where Rembrandt lives. So again, this will be kind of his neighborhood. Slavery was outlawed in the United Provinces, this republic. But they kind of look the other way, to be honest, when some of the Sephardic Jews bring in enslaved people and say, well, they're just my servants. But there is a law in the books that if you're an enslaved person and you come there to the Low Countries, you can go to the magistrate and petition for your freedom. But how do you find out about that law? So, I mean, it's a very true. We have a couple of cases we know of people who did and received their freedom. But what's interesting is we get these images early in this, even in the 1620s, again, very, very early painting for Rembrandt, the baptism of the eunuch. Philip the Evangelist encounters this man who is a eunuch who's kind of the treasure for an African queen. He's been reading the Bible. He's told then about the Gospels, and after he reads and is enlightened by Philip, he asks to be baptized. It's a very obscure subject art, except in the northern Netherlands, where they are writing poems saying you cannot change an African's skin, but you can make their soul white. So the idea of conversion to Christianity is a good that we will pursue. And that's probably what Rembrandt is doing with it. It is also about exoticism, the other. But one thing that's important to realize, and I just showed this, another one of his little etchings, and I suspect before Rembrandt had ever seen any Black person in person. That's my guess on this one, because more stereotypical than he will. But Rembrandt's one of the artists that shows Blacks more often than all but 2 or 3 others in the northern Netherlands at this time, in prints, in paintings, and in drawings. Some of the works that you will find are absolutely beautiful. This is by a student of Rembrandt, Meneer Douw. It's a Trony, which is a fantasy portrait, okay? So it doesn't mean it was commissioned by anyone, but it is, and unfortunately, there's still a little light in here, but it's absolutely beautiful work, very respectful of the sitter. And again, the problem is we never know in these cases. Is this a free person? Is this an enslaved person who's a servant from someone? You know, who are the sitters for these? But what's important to realize is the images of African blacks in the first half of the 17th century tend to be rather positive and respectful by and large. After 1660, and the more that this country gets enmeshed, takes over the transatlantic slave trade, the less positive the images of blacks become. Far more stereotypical, insulting, etc. So that fortunately happens kind of after Rembrandt's career. So here we have one of the 3 kings, the Magi, isolated, clearly, again, based on a person seen in person. This is done, the Dutch would say, from life, but who is standing for this historical figure. Shown, as I said, I think with a great deal of respect and dignity. That's what you will find in a lot of these images, surprisingly. Or this is a contemporary who was a nobleman in the Congo, and he and his king had been fighting on the side of the Dutch against the Portuguese, and then he and his king fall out. So what does he do? He goes to the Netherlands. He said, I'm going to go talk to the head of your country and get some help. So he does. He comes to the Netherlands, and he eventually will go see the governor of Brazil and parts of Africa, Johan Maurits. This portrait is done shortly before it sees Johan Maurits. So he's wearing Portuguese attire in this. There were 2 portraits of him, one done in native African attire and one done here. But once more, I would insist, kind of, we know, rare case where we know who it is and shown as a person who is worthy. At this point, Africans are still in the first half of the century associated more with North Africa, with the Mediterranean world, not with the slave trade. I think that's important. They're seen as a kind of greater dignity, figure of respect. Yes, they're exotic, they're other, their skin is different, but it is not what it will become later. This is what we start seeing more and more of. So here in 1674, he's an alderman in Delft, a bailiff, an important guy, and he's here with his African servant. There were slaves held by Dutch people in the 17th century, even though they weren't supposed to be. Again, they would just call them servants. Often they'd been from sea captains working in Brazil who would take people from Brazil, Africans who had made it to Brazil, and then they take them, make them their servants. Ostensibly a better life in the Netherlands because slavery in Brazil under Portugal was particularly brutal. But nonetheless, we start seeing, again, more and more kind of demeaning, subservient image of them. What of Rembrandt? He'll do some very surprising things. The Visitation, go to Detroit, see it. It's one of the greatest Rembrandts in America. Elizabeth and Mary greet each other. They are both pregnant. It's a wonderful moment. And look at behind the cloak that an African woman, a servant, but not necessarily a slave the way she is presented, is taking off Mary, her traveling cloak, as she's preparing to go inside. Rembrandt seeing this as another person who's kind of in awe in this orbit of the world changing. All right, that's what the story really is about, the coming change from the world of the Hebrew Bible into that of the Christian Bible, and he includes an African. He will do that over and over, Rembrandt, a depiction of St. John the Baptist preaching with a number of Africans in there. Or this really intriguing painting, late in his career, 2 African men, dressed in kind of Roman attire, interesting, ancient Roman, but shown again in this very intimate pose. People have suggested they might be brothers. Once more, we don't know who they are, we don't know their status, but Rembrandt shows them, again, as figures of dignity. Now, he wasn't the only artist who was capable of that. Down in Antwerp, a generation earlier, Rubens did 4 studies of this one black man who was dressed in European attire it's part of the fascination, again, of the difference between people, but he has also shown, a figure of respect, and that you can then work into something like the Adoration of the Magi, which again becomes popular in Catholic Antwerp and around at that time. As I said, what happens after this is you start having fewer paintings of blacks in art, of Africans, and when they show up more in prints that are sort of meant to be kind of almost early anthropology, but shown in very demeaning ways, almost naked, and again, figures of fun and of satire. So when you see them in Amsterdam, here is a group of refugees, ? Inclusion, exclusion, ? They have a very different status. There are intermarriages. We have them on the books in Amsterdam. There is, as I said, this established free community of African blacks in Amsterdam too. So some of them probably could be seen as refugees. Some of them were probably freed by their Portuguese Jewish owners as well. That did happen. And in fact, a number of blacks were buried in a section of one of the Jewish cemeteries right outside Amsterdam, and they makes very clear who they worked for or who they quote unquote belonged for, but are still treated with respect. So here we see different ways of which the theme of the refugees, the other in art, the poor person, all of that can evoke a range of responses in the 16th and 17th century, not unlike they do today. So thank you very much. That's it. Sorry it got a little rushed, but if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes?
Are there instances of paintings where churches are dealing with these refugees either in a hostile way or in a supportive way?
Not that I know of. Are images of churches actually doing some of the work of this? No, I don't recall any of these. The only kind of even public, you will get some of that in Southern Europe with beggars and poor. You will get that related and actually commissioned by churches too. So especially in Italy, but somewhat in parts of France too, but you don't get any of that. So it becomes a Catholic versus Protestant thing in part two by the 17th century.
Do you ever teach any classes that seniors can take on a case?
I don't do them a case, I do them through the Siegel program of CASE. So Siegel Lifelong Learning through CASE, yes, which is I think cheaper.
Those the painting that was so controversial in the beginning of your talk, the two by I'm going to say Bruegel, but
the first one, the original by Peter the Elder, gets painted over when it's owned by Rudolph II.
So has anyone argued on the strength of that that showed his true theology, that he was Protestant because he wanted to show the evils of empire or something?
Oh, no, I think he was very much an Orthodox Catholic. And I think it was more just, he was a huge art collector, Rudolph II, and owning a painting by Peter Bruegel was amazing in his opinion. And I think in a weird way, he almost didn't care what the subject was, just get me a Bruegel. But then let's take away the really distasteful things that my relatives were doing, a generation ago by all the contemporary references. Yeah.
Speaking of Bruegel, is there a rationale why they repeated basically the same scene with different characteristics?
Yeah. First of all, Bruegel's the first one pretty much to do winter scenes, and it's during the Little Ice Age that starts. We don't have this much freezing over till about the mid-16th century. So he invents the winter landscape, which is kind of fun. This is the beginning of the first burgeoning of an open art market, where people are making paintings and prints to be sold directly to the public, not being commissioned, and a lot of them are being produced. And they find out quickly what subjects are popular, and then they make more and more and more of those. By the way, I just want to add one thing. At the very beginning, I didn't get a chance to talk about it, but I included a really interesting painting by Hieronymus Bosch, who was Netherlandish, and was, by the way, hard to believe for most people, probably very rigidly Orthodox Catholic, and condemned everybody because everybody was so damn sinful, he just couldn't take it anymore. And so all the weirdness of Bosch is about that. I just have to, maybe a little alchemy too, but mainly about the sinfulness of humans. But if you look at this online ever, you'll see that's a picture called the wayfarer, the vagabond, the peddler, the pilgrim. People don't know. It's this ragged guy walking through a countryside. He's walking away from a brothel, a tavern that's also a brothel, so supposedly turning his back on that, but he looks a little shady. And art historians go nuts trying to decide, is this positive, is it negative? Is he a pilgrim we're supposed to emulate through life, or is he one of the bad guys? And I think that's important, that it was left a little open-ended. I suspect that people in Bosch's time might have decided differently themselves, depending who looked on it. But it does also show how even these subjects of the poor, the people moving through landscapes, different settings, people tended to be associated with one place still in the 16th and 17th century. And if you're displaced from there, there's something wrong with you, unfortunately, is what a lot of people thought. And so even these people who are peddlers are, suspicious almost by definition. Not necessarily the most welcoming, open society.
I was often struck when I did art history that Northern art is pinched, painful, but their weather was pinched and painful too.
Yeah.
Is that reflected? I mean, the Southern art is voluptuous and sunny all the time.
That argument has certainly been made over and over, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't really impact their sense of propriety or their sense of...
That's really hard to know. That's almost impossible to know, to say how much, the art in general is really affected by climate, topography, everything else. I think, we're human beings. It's hard to say it wouldn't be on some level, California in January is very different from Cleveland in January, and you live a different life. And so I think that is part of it. But it's there. Yeah, but it gets into then all the complications of why Protestantism really only catches on in the North. There are all sorts of issues that go on later with that. It's fun stuff.
My knowledge of religious art is largely tied to the hieratic style of Eastern Orthodox iconography.
Yes.
I was really struck by how these artists from the 16th, 17th century are depicting events that they know were historically happening in Middle East.
Yes.
Before,
Yeah.
but they were depicting it kind of out of time, in that they were so in their time.
Yes.
At that moment.
Yes.
Can you just speak to the element of how naturalistic but yet not naturalistic that is?
That's a great question about the, kind of seeming naturalism is what some art historians call that the style is naturalistic, but settings, et cetera, aren't. And as the young people would say, it's all about being relatable. Okay, it really is. It's about how can we make, for people of our time, how can we help them to understand this? How can we help them understand how this or that event happened in the life of Christ, for instance? How does that become something they can take in and consider instead of the more abstract medieval representations of it? There's really a sea change in art beginning in the 15th century, not just in Italy. There's a Renaissance in the North too. And it is in all cases, I think, about emphasizing the human in religion. And part of that is about changing settings and making them more of that time and place. Yeah. I just want to show you all as we finish, because we got to get out of here. But this is this wonderful catalog that came out in 2021 at the Rembrandt House Museum. It's where Rembrandt was living in that Jewish area of town. And they did a wonderful exhibition about, this recent research about the status, role, and place of all these Africans in the northern Netherlands, specifically in Amsterdam during Rembrandt's time. Thank you very much.